Imagine the world before the world you know. Not ancient Greece, not pharaonic Egypt, not even the earliest ziggurats that archaeologists have managed to date and name. Go further back, past the first cuneiform tablets, past the first cylinder seals, past the first mud brick walls rising from the alluvial plain between two great rivers. Go back to a moment when the concept of order itself was only just being invented, and when the question of who had the right to tell another human being what to do was still raw and unresolved. Answered not by written law, not by elected authority, but by something older and more immediate. The visible, undeniable presence of power. This is Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. The world is in the late Ubaid period, easing slowly, painfully, into what archaeologists call the Uruk era. The rivers flood and recede. The soil left behind is almost impossibly fertile. Small communities are growing into something that no human language yet has a word for: cities. And with that growth comes a problem that has never existed before at this scale. How do you organize thousands of people who do not all know each other? How do you settle disputes between strangers? How do you compel someone to contribute to the irrigation canal, to bring their grain to the communal storehouse, to stop taking their neighbor's livestock? How do you make people obey? The answer, in this world, is not a code of law on a stone tablet. That is still 2,000 years away. The answer in this world is the gods. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia, composed centuries after this period but clearly reaching back into oral traditions far older, describe a time when divine beings walked among human communities and exercised direct authority over them. The Sumerian King List, one of the most remarkable documents from the ancient world, it opens with a passage that scholars still debate and puzzle over. It states that before the Great Flood, kingship descended from heaven. The kings listed are given impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years each, and the cities they ruled are named as the oldest cities known to Sumerian memory: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Sippar, Shuruppak. These are not mythological places. Archaeologists have excavated several of them. They are real. The reigns are not real, but the memory of something ancient and authoritative embedded in these cities clearly is. The Book of Anak, an apocryphal text revered in some Jewish and Ethiopian Christian traditions and excluded from most canonical scriptures, goes further. It describes a class of divine or semi-divine beings called the Watchers, who descended to earth and became entangled with humanity. Their offspring, according to this tradition, were the Nephilim, beings of extraordinary stature and power who populated the pre-flood world. The Genesis account echoes this in a few compressed verses, describing the sons of God taking human wives and producing children who were mighty men, men of renown. These traditions, whatever their ultimate origin, encode something that the archaeology of this period actually does reflect, which is that early Mesopotamian communities understood authority as something that came from above, something superhuman, nuk, something that could not be questioned by ordinary people because it did not originate among ordinary people. This matters for understanding how law and order actually functioned in 4000 BC. Because in the absence of written codes, in the absence of courts, in the absence of police forces or prisons in any recognizable form, the mechanism of social control was overwhelmingly religious and cosmological. The person who decided where the water went, who received extra grain, who was punished for theft or violence, derived that authority from their perceived proximity to divine power. To disobey them was not merely a social transgression. It was an act of cosmic disorder. Walk through a settlement like Eridu in this period, and you see this logic built in mud and clay. Eridu, on the southern edge of the alluvial plain, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world. On excavations there by Iraqi archaeologists in the mid-20th century revealed 18 superimposed temple levels, each one built on top of the last over thousands of years. Each one slightly larger, slightly more elaborate, rising toward the sky with the unmistakable intention of reaching something beyond ordinary human reach. The earliest temples at Eridu date to the 6th millennium BC, and by 4000 BC, the structure standing above the plain is already ancient, already the accumulated memory of generations. It is not merely a place of worship. It is the administrative center of the community. The storehouse is attached to the temple. The authority to distribute food, to manage irrigation schedules, to settle disputes between farmers, belongs to the temple personnel. The person at the apex of this system is sometimes called an En in Sumerian, a word that translates roughly as Lord or High Priest. Though neither translation fully captures what the role meant, the En was understood to be the earthly representative of the city's patron deity, the visible face of divine authority in a world where the gods were believed to be genuinely present, not merely symbolic. When the En spoke, it was understood that the deity spoke through them. When the En rendered a judgment, that judgment carried cosmic weight. Challenging it was not arguing with a man, it was arguing with heaven. What did this look like in practice? This earliest form of law and order. Imagine a dispute between two farmers over the boundary of their irrigated fields. This is not a trivial matter. In a landscape where the difference between a good harvest and starvation can be measured in feet of irrigated soil, where every channel of water is the product of communal labor and careful calculation, a boundary dispute is a survival crisis. The two men do not have a written deed to consult. When there is no parchment, no cadastral map, no surveyor's record, what there is the temple, and the memory of the temple scribes, and the authority of the En to declare what is true. The judgment rendered in such a dispute is delivered in the presence of sacred symbols, divine statues, ritual objects that make the space charged with something beyond the human. Both parties are bound not merely by social obligation to accept the outcome, but by something closer to terror. The gods have witnessed the settlement. To violate it afterward is to invite divine retribution, which in practical terms means the wrath of the community acting in the name of the gods, a force quite capable of destroying an individual or a family who defies the sacred order. Archaeological evidence from slightly later periods, including some of the earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3300 BC, shows us a bureaucratic system already remarkably sophisticated. There are records of grain allocations, labor conscriptions, livestock counts, and what appear to be early administrative lists of personnel and their rations. Scholars like Denise Schmant-Besserat, whose work traced the origins of writing to clay tokens used for accounting, has shown us that before writing existed in any literary sense, the precursors of these tablets were already functioning as instruments of institutional authority. Someone was counting. Someone was allocating. Enoch, someone had the power to determine who received more and who received less. That power was sacred. And in the cultural memory preserved in texts like the Book of Anak and the Sumerian King List, the beings who first exercised it at a grand scale were not entirely human. Whether we read those traditions as encoded memory of an actual historical elite, of chieftains or priests whose physical differences from ordinary people, their height, their health, their literacy, their apparent immunity to some diseases elevated them to quasi-divine status, or whether we treat them purely as theological narrative, they tell us something true about the psychological structure of authority in this world. People in 4000 BC did not believe that other people deserved to rule them. They believed that something greater than human beings had established the order of things, and that the rulers they lived under were the visible expression of that greater order. And this has profound implications for what punishment looked like in this era. Because there are no prison records from 4000 BC, no law tablets, no preserved judicial proceedings, we are working from inference, from analogy with slightly later periods, and from the comparative anthropology of communities at similar stages of development. What we can reasonably reconstruct is a system built on 3 pillars: communal shaming, exclusion, and ritual consequence. Shaming was powerful in communities where everyone knew everyone, where your reputation was your access to mutual aid, to the communal granary in famine years, to labor exchange during harvest, to marriage alliances for your children. To be named before the community as someone who had violated the sacred order was devastating in a way that modern people, insulated by anonymity and institutional systems, struggle to imagine. You were not merely embarrassed, you were endangered. The social fabric that kept you alive was visibly fraying around you. Exclusion was the next step. Being cast out of the settlement, denied access to the irrigated fields, the communal water sources, the protection of the group, was in many climatic conditions a death sentence. Not immediately, but certainly. The margins of the Mesopotamian plain in this period were not wilderness full of game and foraging opportunity. They were salt flats, marsh edges, and open terrain where a single individual without community support had very little chance of long-term survival. Ritual consequence was the dimension that modern legal systems have largely abandoned, but that was absolutely central to authority in 4000 BC, when the temple declared that a person had sinned against the divine order. The consequences were understood to extend beyond the social into the cosmic. Disease, bad harvests, the illness of children, the failure of an irrigation channel, all of these could be interpreted as the working out of divine punishment, not just for the individual offender, but potentially for the entire community that had tolerated the offense. This created a powerful incentive for communities to police themselves, to bring violators before the temple authority, to visibly enforce the sacred order, because the alternative was collective suffering. The beings remembered in the Enochic tradition as the Nephilim, whatever their historical analog, unless were understood in these oral traditions as figures who disrupted precisely this order. Their transgression in the text is the corruption of boundaries between the human and the divine, the introduction of forbidden knowledge, the violence and consumption that results from beings too powerful to be governed by ordinary social constraint. There is something in this narrative that resonates with what we know archaeologically about the tensions of early complex society, the emergence of an elite class whose access to surplus, to information, to sacred authority placed them genuinely beyond the reach of the mechanisms that governed everyone else. How do you hold accountable the person who holds everyone else accountable? This was not merely a theological problem in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a live political crisis, one that the flood narratives, in some readings, were resolved by catastrophic divine intervention when human hierarchy becomes too corrupt to correct itself. And then the flood comes, or rather, the memory of floods, which in southern Mesopotamia were not mythological events, but regular and terrifying realities. Geological evidence, including flood deposits at sites like Ur and Shuropak, dated to the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BC. This shows genuine catastrophic inundation events that would have been world-ending in scale from the perspective of communities living on the alluvial plain. What washed away in those floods was not just mud and grain and mud brick. What washed away was the accumulated institutional memory, the oral tradition of authority. the carefully maintained records of land boundaries and labor obligations, the living personnel who knew who owned what and who owed whom. Starting over, in the aftermath, Balra required rebuilding the entire apparatus of order from something even more fundamental than memory. It required the gods to descend again, figuratively or literally, in the understanding of the people who survived, and re-establish the foundations. You can feel the weight of this when you stand, or imagine standing, on the tells of southern Iraq today. Those artificial hills that are the accumulated remains of millennia of human habitation. Eridu is accessible, or was before recent conflicts restricted travel in the region, as an archaeological site near the modern city of Nasiriyah. Standing at the base of the eroded ziggurat mound there, looking out across a landscape that was once the edge of a vast wetland ecosystem, you are standing where the oldest remembered city in Sumerian tradition once coordinated the lives of thousands of people without a single written law. What held it together was something we have not fully replaced. Not law codes, not police, not courts, but a shared belief that the order of things was sacred, that transgressing it invited consequences beyond the merely human, and that the authority to define and enforce that order came from somewhere above the reach of ordinary life. These people built the foundations of everything that came after. They invented the administrator, the judge, the sacred executive, the idea that a community could be governed by principle rather than pure force. They did it without paper, and without metal tools in most cases, without wheels in the earliest phases, working only with the clay of the riverbank, the reeds of the marsh, the accumulated knowledge of generations passed down in story and ritual. And when catastrophe came, as it always came, they rebuilt. They always rebuilt. That is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the ancient world. Not that it was brutal, though it was. Not that it was dark, though the darkness was absolute on moonless nights, far from any hearth fire. It is that people in conditions we would consider unendurable kept reaching for something larger than mere survival. They kept trying to make order from chaos, to make the world make sense, to find in the vast indifference of nature and time something that resembled justice. What other lost worlds should we step into next? What questions do you carry about the civilizations that came before everything we think of as history? Leave them below. We are only just beginning.